Hey there friends, David Lightbringer here, and it's time to talk about why Jon Snow is Azor Ahai Reborn. And yes, I did just make a video called Daenerys Azor Ahai Reborn. And yes, Daenerys did already fulfill the prophecy, waking dragons from stone beneath the bleeding star. Maester Aemon, Archmaester Marwyn, and High Priest of Valorism, Bam Bam Bonero, all agree it's definitely Daenerys. And it does seem hard to deny, but also hard to deny is the evidence that there may be more than one person who fulfills the prophecies, and specifically that one of those other people will be Jon Snow. So take a look at our sections here. This is kind of where we're going today. Three Heads has the Prince That Was Promised Dragon, the purpose of R+L J, Jon's Azor Ahai dream, Melisandre's visions of Jon, Jon's role as leader of the Watch, the Pact of Ice and Fire, Jon's symbolic scenes with Ygritte, and the grand finale last section about Jon being a new Sword of the Morning and wielding Dawn. We're going to get right down to business today. So this is the first section, the Azor Ahai Reborn that was promised has three heads, meaning that the Song of Ice and Fire will be sung not as a solo, but as a chorus. Any talk of Jonzor Ahai, if you will, has to begin with the idea that it can be more than one person, since Daenerys, like I said, already did fulfill the prophecies. And in fact, this notion first comes to us not from any fan theory, but from Rhaegar himself in Dany's House of the Undying vision, where we see Rhaegar and Elia with their two young children, Rhaenys and baby Aegon. This is seemingly a depiction of a real conversation that Rhaegar and Elia had, or perhaps an approximation of real conversations that they had at this time. "Aegon," he said to a woman nursing a newborn babe in a great wooden bed, "what better name for a king?" "Will you make a song for him?" the woman asked. "He has a song," the man replied. "He is the prince that was promised, and his is the Song of Ice and Fire." He looked up when he said it, and his eyes met Dany's, and it seemed as if he saw her standing there beyond the door. "There must be one more," he said, though whether he was speaking to her or the woman in the bed, she could not say. "The dragon has three heads." All right, so this is a truly incredible passage here. Rhaegar, trying to interpret prophecy and symbolism much in the way that we are, links together these three important concepts: the prince that was promised, the Song of Ice and Fire, which is a phrase we know come from Aegon's dream of ice and fire, and the concept of the dragon having three heads, which Rhaegar apparently interprets to mean there will be three special children of destiny, right? And he clearly thinks that two of those three children are his two children with Elia, Rhaenys and Aegon, whom we can't help but notice he's named after two of the three conquerors, right? Rhaenys and Aegon. So apparently Visenya, Aegon, and Rhaenys can be thought of as making up their own three-headed dragon. Now the dream has Rhaegar look right at Daenerys and say, "There must be one more," which is a hard-to-miss clue, obviously, that Daenerys, in some sense, will be a fulfillment of these prophecies. And at some point, whenever Dany actually hears about one of these prophecies, she'll probably think back to this scene in Rhaegar's words and start putting some of this together. Daenerys is already chewing on the meaning of the three heads has the dragon thing and coming to the conclusion that it must mean three people to ride her three dragons. And that's also exactly what Ser Jorah thinks it means when Dany tells him about the words of the Undying. And of course, it is a very practical notion. We do need three people to ride the dragons. Unlike on the Game of Thrones TV show, dragons will not fight or fly in any sort of controlled manner if they don't have a rider. And perhaps this is why Dany is named Mother of Dragons, Child of Three in the House of the Undying. She is one of three people who will ride her three dragons and fulfill the prophecies. Now, as Maester Aemon says, the original word translated as prince is actually a genderless word, and thus the promised prince is not necessarily male. Aemon famously hears about Dany's dragons and does an immediate facepalm and says, "Yeah, it's Dany. We were thinking the wrong way because of the mistranslation." Actually, he says, "The language misled us all for 1,000 years," which, by the way, also implies that the prince that was promised prophecy is thousands of years old and thus predates Aegon's dream of ice and fire. Melisandre actually says that directly, in fact. She uses Azor Ahai Reborn and the prince that was promised interchangeably 3 different times, and says that his coming was prophesied 5,000 years ago. And when Melisandre speaks to Maester Aemon about fighting the others, Maester Aemon says, "It is the war for the dawn you speak of. Where is the prince that was promised?" With Melisandre then pointing to Stannis and saying, "There he is, Azor Ahai Reborn." So even though it isn't Stannis, they both are speaking as if the prince that was promised in Azor Ahai Reborn are the same prophecy, which again is thousands of years old. You can also tell that Maester Aemon thinks they are the same thing, because when he hears about Dany's dragons, which are specifically part of the Azor Ahai Reborn prophecy, he says, aha, she must be the prince that was promised. So, Azor Ahai Reborn, the prince that was promised, they may be the same person, who may be three persons. Another clue that these will be three dragon riders comes in the wording of the Azor Ahai Reborn prophecy that doesn't talk about dragons, actually. When the stars bleed and the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world, a warrior shall draw from the fire a burning sword, and that sword shall be Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. And he who clasps it shall be Azor Ahai come again, and the darkness shall flee before him. So as we discussed in the Daenerys Azor Ahai Reborn video, Dany's dragons are her Lightbringer, because they are the weapon that she drew forth from the fire and will now use to fight against the darkness. And because dragons and comets and flaming swords can all symbolize one another, and often do in A Song of Ice and Fire, as I'm sure you all know. So if the dragons are Lightbringers, then whoever clasps these weapons, meaning rides the dragons, shall be Azor Ahai Reborn, and that means we should look for three of them. Doesn't really take a rocket scientist to identify Jon Snow as one of these potential dragon riders, since he is a secret Targaryen, and since we've already seen the TV show version ride a dragon himself. Of course, there's no book equivalent to the show Night King, who was the third dragon rider, but obviously I've been talking about Euron, so I do think the third head of the dragon will be a villain, as it was on the show. And of course, Euron, although he doesn't have Valyrian blood, he does cosplay as a Valyrian, and more importantly, he's got that dragonbinder horn, which is specifically said to be able to bind dragons to someone's will through some slightly unknown form of magic that we will no doubt see in the Winds of Winter. I'll talk more about that in the Euron Azor Ahai video, forthcoming, but first we're going to prove that Jon Snow is a special snowflake. Now, one thing I want to lay out right at the beginning, this essay will be about foreshadowing and symbolism that indicates that Jon will fulfill the prophecy of Azor Ahai Reborn, not that he has done so already. Daenerys, on the other hand, has already done her version of the fulfillment of the prophecy, whereas I believe that we should look for Jon to do his version of it, probably when he's resurrected. And I do fully anticipate that the Red Comet will return and that Jon's resurrection will coincide with its return. Jon Snow will probably be the dragon woken from stone, and I believe the whole thing will actually parallel the scene with Drogo's pyre, with Melisandre walking into the pyre as Daenerys walked into the pyre, and you can actually hear all about it in a video I did called Jon Snow's Pyre. So no, Jon hasn't yet fulfilled the prophecy. Stop typing that, you right there. I see you, stop. Oh, you didn't watch the video, you're just commenting without watching. Anyway, but for those of you who made it through the first section, I will now show you all the ways in which George has indicated that Jon will eventually fulfill the prophecies and lead the fight against the others in the new War for the Dawn as Azor Ahai Reborn. All right, part two, the real purpose of R+L = J. Since we've started off talking about how Rhaegar thinks the prince that was promised is a dragon with 3 heads, and how Dany thinks this means 3 dragon riders for her 3 dragons, let's talk about how Jon riding a dragon is the whole damn point of R+L = J. So one of the reasons why the prince that was promised was kind of a dud on the Game of Thrones show was because they only used the reveal about Jon's parents being Rhaegar and Lyanna to generate political conflict between Jon and Dany. And although there surely will be some amount of political intrigue that comes from the reveal in the books, it also seems clear to many of us that the Iron Throne is ultimately a false prize in terms of its role in the story. And for Daenerys specifically, the idea of using her dragons to conquer Westeros and sit the Iron Throne definitely seems like a kind of trap that she must eventually see through and pass up. The same is true for any potential claim to the throne that Jon would have, and Jon is already focused on the threat of the others. Plus, by the time that Jon learns who he really is, he'll be a resurrected person and may not be as interested in things like the Iron Throne. I also think we can expect the climax of the books to be the fight against the others and not coming back to King's Landing to fight for the throne again after saving the world. So for all these reasons, I think it's very unlikely that a fight for the throne is going to be the major plot action that follows the reveal that Jon is a secret Targaryen, and likely a trueborn one if indeed Rhaegar and Lyanna got married on the Isle of Faces, as this Just and Sweet calendar art seems to indicate that they did. And there's other clues too. Lyanna's dress spattered with gore and Theon's vision. Check out R+L J, a love story. Now, I would assert that the main reason Jon is a crouching direwolf hidden dragon is because he is destined to ride one of Dany's dragons in the fight against the others, as per the prophecy. After all, that's why Jon was conceived in the first place, because Rhaegar was specifically trying to give birth to the third head of the prince that was promised dragon. Not only is that evident in the scene that we just quoted, where Rhaegar is clearly occupied with all of these end times prophecies, we also now know that Rhaegar and Lyanna visited the Isle of Faces shortly after the tourney of Harrenhal, which means that the old gods were interfering in matters too. And we already kind of knew that the old gods want to try to help the prince that was promised get born, because famously the ghost of the High Heart, who is some kind of weirwood priestess and quite possibly a hybrid children of the forest human being. She's only about 3 feet tall and she has those red eyes like a green seer. And she gave a prophecy that the prince that was promised would be born of the line of Aerys and Rhaella, which is why their dad, Jaehaerys II, married them to one another. In other words, it seems that both Rhaegar, who based his beliefs on ancient Valyrian and Targaryen prophecies, and probably some of his own prophetic dreams, as well as the old gods of the Weirwood, who see the past and the future, were intending that Jon be born as the prince that was promised, with both Rhaegar and the old gods apparently believing that the end times were near and the need for this prophesied prince at hand. Thus, the purpose for Jon being a secret Targaryen has always been long night stuff, not making a claim for the throne stuff. That's why it's kind of curious that the show did have Jon ride a dragon, but then never had anyone discuss why it was that he was able to ride the dragon. Not Jon or Daenerys or anyone else, but I expect it will be precisely the opposite in the books. There will be some discussion. As you can see, Jon's identity as a Targaryen is expressly wrapped up in his identity as the prince that was promised and Azor Ahai Reborn. And in fact, it doesn't even really matter if he's trueborn or not in this context, only that he has the magic dragon blood to mix with his magic skin changer blood, and possibly his magic other blood if the Starks have the blood of the other, as I have theorized that they do. So he's quite the cocktail, old Johnny boy. So there's a fun line of foreshadowing about Jon and dragons that comes in a storm of swords as Jon is thinking about what they would really need to defend the wall. We should have 20 trebuchets, not 2, and they should be mounted on sledges and turntables so we could move them. It was a futile thought. He might as well wish for another 1,000 men and maybe a dragon or 3. Now, as it happens, we do know someone with a dragon or 3. 2 turntables and a dragon or 3. Yeah, not my best. But as we saw in the Daenerys Azor Ahai video, and thanks for watching that, by the way, thank you. There is plenty of foreshadowing that Dany will be bringing her dragons north to the wall, and that her and Jon will be going on a journey to the heart of winter. Alright, so even though Dany's dragons are her Lightbringer, her weapon against which the darkness cannot stand, I do think the prophecies refer to actual flaming swords, especially since they, already exist in the story, and especially since Jon Snow dreams about wielding one while defending the wall in a scene which kinda seems like, the War for the Dawn. We're about to break this dream down in detail, but for now you can see it here on the screen, and the basics are pretty clear. Jon is fighting some version of the War for the Dawn with a burning red sword, and if that doesn't make us think about Jon being Azor Ahai Reborn, then nothing will. The original Azor Ahai, of course, was said to have fought off the darkness with a burning red sword called Lightbringer, and the Westerosi legend of the Last Hero, of course, has him fighting against the others with a magic blade made of dragon steel, which the others could not stand against. So, maybe we should look for an Azor Ahai Reborn person with an actual magic sword, and maybe that person is Jon Snow. Now, although legends like these can, of course, be symbolic and figurative, it is very hard to ignore the fact that there are actual magic swords in both of these stories, which come from halfway across the world. Even harder to ignore is Dawn, the ancestral sword of House Dane, which they have supposedly possessed since the Dawn Age. This anachronistic, one-of-a-kind, actual magical sword is an obvious suspect to have been the dragonsteel sword of the Last Hero, for several reasons, which we'll get into in the last section of the video. And Dawn may also be the same sword as Azor Ahai's Lightbringer, of course, again, for reasons that we will get into later in the video. For now, the simple point I want to demonstrate is that magic swords seem important, and thus one form of Azor Ahai Reborn seems like he should have a magic sword. Crucially, Jon's most clear piece of Azor Ahai Reborn foreshadowing is that dream of him defending the wall against undead foes with a burning red sword, so let's get into it. Burning shafts hissed upward, trailing tongues of fire. Scarecrow brothers tumbled down, black cloaks ablaze. Snow, an eagle cried, as foemen scuttled up the ice like spiders. Jon was armored in black ice, but his blade burned red in his fist. As the dead men reached the top of the wall, he sent them down to die again. He slew a graybeard and a beardless boy, a giant, a gaunt man with filed teeth, a girl with thick red hair. Too late, he recognized Ygritte. She was gone as quick as she'd appeared. The world dissolved into a red mist. Alright, so much like Dany's waking of the dragons in Drogo's pyre, this is a scene where multiple legends and prophecies are being acted out together and sort of superimposed on top of one another. So first of all, Jon is Azor Ahai Reborn. He's wielding a burning red sword, which is Longclaw in this dream, and he's defending the wall against undead foes who scuttle up the ice like spiders. But he's also like the original last hero here, whose 12 companions all died and left him alone to face the others, because all Jon's friends have abandoned him. This is noted in the previous paragraph. And his only companions are the Scarecrow brothers, who represent dead Night's Watchmen and are even named after the fallen Night's Watchmen. So again, we have the implication that Jon is like the last hero with a bunch of dead companions. And finally, Jon is also acting out the original Azor Ahai Forging of Lightbringer myth, because he's stabbing his love Ygritte with his burning red sword, with the world even dissolving into a red mist right after he does that. Which reminds me of the way the second moon cracked when Nissa cried out with anguish and ecstasy. Jon is also slaying Ygritte sorrowfully and regretfully, as the legend says that Azor Ahai slew Nissa. And this is all a dream, of course. Jon didn't actually slay Ygritte, but he is carrying a heavy sense of guilt over betraying her, and it was his fellow watchman who killed her. So in his dream, it's him that did it. But this isn't just Jon's subconscious working out his guilt about Ygritte. It's also clear foreshadowing of him being Azor Ahai Reborn. And I can only take that to mean that Jon is Azor Ahai Reborn. And actually, there may be a clue that Bloodraven also thinks that Jon is Azor Ahai Reborn here, because as the dream is sort of escalating in intensity and Jon is losing control, doing one of those Jon Rage Berserker Fury things, he is woken from the dream by an old man's gnarled hand that grabs his shoulder. And we don't see who the hand belongs to, but the obvious guess would be Bloodraven, who is like 150 years old. And gnarled is also a word often used for tree bark and tree limbs. And Bloodraven is half a tree. So it may be that Bloodraven is tampering with Jon's dream here, or even sending it to him outright, as Bloodraven obviously sent dreams to Bran. And that means that Bloodraven thinks that Jon is the prince that was promised, and is using this dream to try to awaken him to his destiny. Very like Quaithe is seemingly sending Dany that Azor Ahai dream of her fighting the others on Dragonback. And for what it's worth, Bloodraven may have been sending Rhaegar dreams, for all we know, when he was trying to figure out how to give birth to the 3 Azor Ahai Rebornlings, prince that was promised the kids, you know. And then to complement this dream, or perhaps to lead up to it, since these scenes come first, Martin gives us a couple of other little clues that Jon should wield a burning sword. In A Game of Thrones, Lord Commander Mormont is speaking to Jon, and he says, "Are you such a mighty warrior, or do you carry a grumpkin in your pocket to magic up your sword?" And now, at long last, we know what grumpkins are for. Magicking up swords. And of course, this folkloric belief that Mormont is jokingly espousing here may be based on the very real fact that the Children of the Forest have been providing the Night's Watch with dragon glass weapons for centuries and even millennia. And it may also refer, even going all the way back, to the fact that the last hero seemingly received help from the Children of the Forest in between the time when he broke his sword and then later re-emerged with this blade of dragon steel. So maybe the elves, the Grumpkids, if you will, helped the last hero reforge or repair or re-magic up his sword. And then finally, one of the reasons why it's frustrating and a little bit hilarious that the TV show never had Jon light his sword on fire, even though he was hanging out with Beric, who similarly, R'hllor brought both of us back, you and me. He watched Beric light his sword on fire. Never thought to do it when he was fighting the Night King and the Whites. All of that was silly. Well, it was silly just for its own sake, but also because of this passage, because the books actually do have Jon stop and specifically ponder just how useful that would be. Clytus blinked. A sword that makes its own heat would be a fine thing on the wall. Jon put aside his wine cup and drew on his black moleskin gloves. A pity that the sword Stannis wields is cold. Jon Snow is Azor Ahai Reborn, champion of R'hllor, and Melisandre is close to figuring it out. At least it seems so, based on this passage from A Dance with Dragons, from Melisandre's one very revealing POV chapter. "What do you see, my lady?" the boy asked softly. "Skulls, 1,000 skulls, and the bastard boy again, Jon Snow." Whenever she was asked what she saw within her fires, Melisandre would answer, "Much and more." But seeing was never as simple as those words suggested. It was an art, and like all arts, it demanded mastery, discipline, study. Pain, that too. R'hllor spoke to his chosen ones through blessed fire, in a language of ash and cinder and twisting flame that only a god could truly grasp. Melisandre had practiced her art for years beyond count, and she had paid the price. There was no one, even in her order, who had her skill at seeing the secrets half revealed and half concealed within the sacred flames. Yet now she could not even seem to find her king. I pray for a glimpse of Azor Ahai, and R'hllor shows me only snow. So as we, the reader, are reading through this, a couple of things stand out. First off, Melisandre is saying that she sees the bastard boy again, Jon Snow. Apparently she's seeing Jon in the flame visions a lot, over and over again. Then the last line, it's like an oncoming iceberg of truth to Mel's titanic belief in Stannis as Azor Ahai Reborn. She asks to see Azor Ahai, and the only quote, only thing the flames will show her is capital S Snow, the bastard boy, Jon Snow again. It's actually low-key hilarious how Melisandre goes on this tangent about how no one in her order has her skill at seeing the secrets hidden in the flames, and then stares right at Azor Ahai Jon Snow and is like, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on here. She can't even get the flames to show her Stannis at all, almost as if Jon Snow is, much more important. And when Melisandre does see Jon in her fires, this is what it looks like. The flames crackled softly, and in their crackling she heard the whispered name, Jon Snow. His long face floated before her, limned in tongues of red and orange, appearing and disappearing again, a shadow half seen behind a fluttering curtain. Now he was a man, now a wolf, now a man again. But the skulls were here as well. The skulls were all around him. Melisandre had seen his danger before, had tried to warn the boy of it. Enemies all around him, daggers in the dark. He would not listen. So Melisandre is not only seeing Jon Snow again and again, the flames are actually whispering his name. We always think about flame visions, right? They're actually talking to Melisandre, like a bowl of Rice Krispies from the 80s, snap, crackle, pop, for those of you who are old like me. So yeah, they're really trying to tell Melisandre, like, Jon Snow. Couldn't be any more clear. And we see that Jon appears as a man and then a wolf, and then a man again, and all the while surrounded by skulls. So this is seemingly a visualization, it's not hard to interpret this, of Jon's death and resurrection, right? Because he's going to spend a little quality time in Ghost doing the second life thing before he's resurrected. So man, then a wolf in Ghost, and then a man again returned to his body. Now, many people have speculated that Melisandre will have a role in Jon's resurrection, and that was true even before the show showed us Melisandre washing and cutting Jon's hair. Obviously, it's going to be a little more involved than that. And Bran may be involved too. It may be very complicated. I've got a few theories about this, but the point is, if Melisandre is involved in Jon's resurrection, then he probably will be a Firewhite. And as a Firewhite, he will have limbs of fire, limbs tongued in red and orange, at least when he grips his burning red sword. So as we discussed in the Dany Azor Ahai Reborn video and in the Melisandre Secrets video and elsewhere, Firewhites such as Beric have the ability to light their own swords on fire with their own R'hllor-powered fiery blood, and that's true both in the show and in the books. And notably, you don't need to stab any women. You don't need to nissa anyone to make a burning sword if you are a Firewhite. So on the show, obviously, Jon stabbed Dany because she was a mad queen, and even though she's not probably going to go down that road in the books, some people have speculated that Jon might end up stabbing Dany for a magical reason, to make a Lightbringer sword, but I don't think that'll be necessary because he's probably going to be a Firewhite and can do it himself. And thus, I think it would make a lot of sense if Jon were to become a Firewhite, and perhaps other Night's Watchmen as well. So Jon's Azor Ahai dream seems to foreshadow him wielding a burning red sword, and as you can see, the mechanics of the story set him up to be able to do that. Sooner or later, Melisandre will realize that Jon is Azor Ahai Reborn, and in need of the promised rebornness, the rebirth, the resurrection. And once she puts that together, pretty much nothing will stop her from resurrecting Jon, including walking into the pyre herself, if need be. Jon will then be able to turn Longclaw, or any other sword, into a Lightbringer. And as Jon and Clyde has said, a sword that can make its own heat would be a fine thing on the wall. Tormund Giantsbane also asks Jon, "Can your sword cut cold?" With Jon then going on a little inner monologue trip about Dragonsteel. We will see, Jon thought, remembering the things that Sam had told him, the things he'd found in his old books. Longclaw had been forged in the fires of old Valyria, forged in dragonflame and set with spells. Dragonsteel, Sam called it, stronger than any common steel. Lighter, harder, sharper. But words in a book were one thing. The true test came in battle. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, this is more evidence that Jon is Azor Ahai Reborn. The fact that George has set up the story mechanics so that Jon will be able to create his own Lightbringer. All right, Jon's Frozen Fire. This is going to be a really cool section because this is basically going to use all Stark stuff, Stark symbolism and Night's Watch stuff to prove that Jon is Azor Ahai. That's right, it's not just about his Targaryen heritage, but also about his Stark heritage and symbolism. And before we even talk symbolism, it's important to observe the basic narrative role that Azor Ahai Reborn / the Prince that was promised is supposed to play, which is that they are supposed to fight the forces of the Long Night, which means the others and the Whites, with dragons and flaming swords. The last hero is specifically said to have led the first men of the Night's Watch into the War for the Dawn, and indeed the purpose of the Night's Watch and Azor Ahai Reborn are one in the same. So Jon Snow is simply the person who is already doing those things. As Lord Commander of the Watch, he's responsible for defending the realms of men, just like the last hero. And Jon is a Lord Commander who is already keenly focused, as we said, on the others, having already slain an Ice White in Mormont's chamber. And, of course, he's been doing research about the others with Sam and collecting the dragon glass and preparing to face them, etc., etc. So look at this from the others' perspective for a second, if you will. The very first time they launch an attack on the Night's Watch, one of those damned Prince that was promised Azor Ahai Rebornlings is right there to foil them. Rats, foiled again. Those damn meddling kids. Even though Jon is only 15 and green as summer grass, as they say. So as much as we're all fascinated in the interpreting signs and portents angle of things, the basic facts of the narrative are just as important, if not more so. I mean, after all, Daenerys hasn't even heard of the others or the prince that was promised yet. She surely will learn about them, perhaps from Jon, and whenever she does eventually make her way north with her dragons to fight the others, who do you think she'll be working with? Jon Snow, obviously. In other words, the Azor Ahai Reborn prince that was promised hero twins are already set up by the story to work together, even if no prophecy existed at all. So in this way, this story is kind of like the opposite of the way that Dune deals with prophecy. Paul obviously is wrestling with this burden of knowing way too much about the future. Jon and Dany are kind of in the opposite boat. They're already heading towards this destiny without even knowing about the prophecy. And Jon has actually just heard about it, of course, in Dance, but isn't thinking about it applying to him, despite the dream. And of course, he's dead now, so maybe it'll occur to him while he's dead and dreaming. But we're actually going to talk about that in a couple sections. So the original purpose of the watch that Jon leads is to fight the others, and that's apparent in their oaths, of course. They swear that they are the swords in the darkness and the lights that bring the dawn. That sentence may be more literally true than the Watchmen expect, since I do think we'll see a few of them running around in the darkness with flaming swords trying to end the long night. The Night's Watch oath is modeled on Lightbringer, in other words, and this is more evidence that the last hero's Dragonsteel was probably the same thing as Lightbringer. You could even say that the Night's Watch oath makes the Watchmen themselves sound like they are Lightbringers, as if they are the swords in the darkness which give off light. I mean, that's what it says. They would be black swords, though, since they obviously dress all in black all the time. And by way of comparison, the Kingsguard are called the White Swords because they dress in white. Of course, black swords and knives are just the kind that you want against the others, since it is dragonglass and probably Valyrian steel weapons which slay the others. So with all that in mind, check out this quote from Stannis to Jon in A Dance with Dragons. "But you are the weapon the Lord has given me. I have found you here as you found the cache of dragonglass beneath the fist, and I mean to make use of you. Even Azor Ahai did not win his war alone." Jon Snow is a weapon that comes from the Lord, from R'hllor. And that'll be even more true, obviously, if Jon is resurrected by Melisandre. So Jon is a weapon to be used against the others, like the dragonglass, which is always referred to as Jon's dragonglass. And of course, this makes sense because Jon is the leader of the Night's Watch, these shining black swords in the darkness. Dragonglass itself is an especially apt symbol for Jon, since dragonglass is also frozen fire, and since Jon is very much a frozen dragon, right? He's a dragon hidden in the north in Winterfell under the name Snow. And since Jon dresses all in black, he is a black frozen dragon. So yeah, frozen fire, dragonglass Jon, that's what I call him. And like dragonglass, Jon is a weapon to use against the others. You see how this works now. And then the final line from Stannis about Azor Ahai not winning his war alone simply reminds us of the need for teamwork. From the three heads of the drill, at least two of the, I don't know if we can get much teamwork from Euron, but Jon and Dany will need to work together, and of course they'll need to work together with Bran and all the other forces of the living. So Jon's Azor Ahai dream that we read a little earlier kind of seems to depict Jon as a piece of burning dragonglass, or as a black sword burning red, as the Night's Watch are, the black swords shining in the darkness. Recall the line, "He was armored in black ice, but his blade burned red in his fist." Although the armored in black ice could refer to a few things. It could refer to his body being frozen. It could also refer to Jon eventually wearing Euron's Valyrian steel armor, since Ned's Valyrian steel sword is called ice, so armored in black ice could be armored in Valyrian steel. But since dragonglass is called frozen fire and essentially looks like black ice, as you can see on this very cool alternate Winds of Winter cover art by Urtach Altanaz. And just as dragonglass, or obsidian as it is also known, is specifically magma which cools under specific circumstances, all steel swords are, of course, created in a molten state and then frozen, or cooled and hardened, if you will, into the shape of steel swords. And then Valyrian steel swords specifically are forged in dragon fire, so they are frozen dragon fire, where dragonglass is frozen fire. Very similar ideas. In other words, black ice, quote-unquote, and frozen fire are both kind of like symbolic expressions which George is using to describe not only Valyrian steel and dragonglass, the weapons that kill the others, but also Jon and the Night's Watch itself, who are like black blades burning with the fire that could end the long night. Then we have the crown of the Kings of Winter, which suggests that the original purpose of the Starks was also fighting the others, since that crown is described as a bronze circlet surmounted with 9 miniature black iron swords. As you probably remember, Jon on the show was named King of the North when he led the forces of the living against the others and the Whites. And I do think that will happen in the books as well. The Stark Kings of Winter seem to have the same general purpose as the Night's Watch, and probably a shared origin, right? Like, who doesn't think the last hero and his dog weren't a Stark and his wolf? So they may have been a King of Winter, or the first King of Winter, or perhaps the title King of Winter was created in honor of their triumph over winter. So it makes a lot of sense that these subsequent Stark Kings of Winter would wear crowns with black iron swords on them. It's a crown based on the deeds that ended the first long night, when the Starks and the Watch defeated winter itself, when winter fell and the Starks became kings over the lands of winter. That's why the Stark words are, "Winter is coming." Their duty is to prepare for and warn people about the very terrible winter that can come every 8,000 years or so. And then, down in the crypts, the stone kings of winter sit their thrones with black iron longswords across their laps, sending the same message. Our prime directive is slaying the others. Best of all, the older black swords have rusted red. So black swords turning red, just like Jon's black steel longclaw burning with red fire. And thus, it would make a lot of sense if Jon were named King in the North, which is just the newer version of King of Winter, and if he were to wear a crown of black iron swords, while he's wielding black swords and knives and leading the Watch, who are like black swords. And when Stannis tempts Jon with the offer to become Jon Stark, trueborn Lord of Winterfell, Jon's hunger for it is described as being as sharp as a dragonglass blade. Stand back or I'll cut you, is what I'm saying, or what Jon's saying, I guess. Now, the Stark ancestral family sword, which we've mentioned a couple times, Ice, is, of course, probably the best symbol of the Red Comet and of Lightbringer. Arya compares the Red Comet to her father's black Valyrian blade, covered in blood, and the bleeding star up in the sky is, actually, of course, a black ball of ice, because that's what comets are, right? Even though it looks like a fire dragon, if you will, comets are made up of frozen ice, dirt, rock, and trace metals. And in fact, their outer surface is covered by a kind of black tar, similar to the tar that forms on your barbecue grill. And shout out to Yin Tar, one of the other names for Azor Ahai. So yeah, a black sword called Ice that gets covered in blood and then looks like the Red Comet is, that's pretty much just perfect. Now, Ice has, of course, somewhat rudely, been split in half by none other than Tywin Lannister. And now its twin blades, Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail, have been dyed red. Well, technically, they're red and black, like waves of night and blood. Hey, waves of night and blood, that kind of sounds like a darkness caused by waves of bleeding stars. Yeah, that's exactly the idea. So Ned's black ice turned into a couple of red swords, like the red sword of heroes, and I believe the black swords that have rusted red in the laps of the kings of winter, down in the crypts, are essentially complementing this symbolism, all of which suggests that the King of Winter should wield Lightbringer, just as Jon does in his dream. Jon even shouts, "I am the Lord of Winterfell," right in the middle of the Azor Ahai dream. All right, so one last note on the King of Winter, and this is definitely going to be the shortest version of this that I've ever done. So the title King of Winter is actually drawn from European folklore related to the Green Man and the Beltane festival in spring. It used to be the custom in some places to take dead shoots and stalks from the harvest and weave them together into a little sort of straw man, a couple of feet high, and this was called the King of Winter. You hold on to this little figure through the winter, during which time he gets dry and brown and dead, and then in the spring, you set him on fire at the Beltane festival as part of the ceremony to help usher in the spring. So let me just say that again. The King of Winter is like a dead green man whose job it is to catch on fire and become a burning man to help end the winter and usher in the spring. And gosh, that sounds a lot like Jon as a fire wight, helping to end the long night after he was a dead skin changer, which is a bit like a dead green man, since the skin changer powers are part of the broader umbrella of green powers. One of the things we didn't see on the show was the Pact of Ice and Fire, which is the name for the agreement hammered out between Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen and Lord Cregan Stark of Winterfell. If you want the full story on this, check out my Jace video from before the season, as well as the Jon's Dragon Dream video. But here's the short version of the book version, which is quite a bit longer than the House of the Dragon version. So in Fire and Blood, Jace and Cregan spend a bunch of quality dude bro time, if you will, hunting, hawking, bonding, who knows what else. Their agreement to firm up the Stark allegiance to Rhaenyra centers around an agreement to wed Jace's future daughter, who isn't born yet, to Cregan's young son, who has been born yet. It's pretty standard Alliance of the Great Houses stuff, to be honest, but it gets this grandiose name, the Pact of Ice and Fire. This has led myself and Grey Area and a bunch of other people to speculate that maybe Aegon's dream of ice and fire may have been discussed here, and obviously that would give Cregan extra incentive to ally with Rhaenyra, because Rhaenyra would be the side of the civil war that takes the threat of the others seriously, right? So what does this have to do with Jon Snow? Well, there's a rumor that Jace slept with Cregan's bastard sister, Sarah Snow, and even married her in secret in front of the Winterfell heart tree. Sarah Snow is a mushroom-only account, as is this whole part of the story, so we don't know if she ever existed or if this ever happened, but the important thing is the literary parallel that is created. A Targaryen prince and a secret weirwood wedding to a Stark maiden in the middle of a war. And Sarah even has Jon's bastard name of Snow. And then most importantly, because Jace, mild spoiler alert, does not survive the war and never has that daughter, this pact goes unfulfilled. And there are no Starks that married Targaryens, until Rhaegar and Lyanna conceived Jon. So Jon is actually the fulfillment of the Pact of Ice and Fire, which kind of seems like a clue to make us think that Jon might be the prince that was promised, that Aegon dreamt of in his dream of ice and fire. And then on top of that, this information actually first came to us not in Fire and Blood, but in the world of Ice and Fire, in the section about Winterfell, which weirdly has a lot of information about dragons just sort of shoved in there. It's why so much dragons in the Winterfell section, I wondered when I first read it. So there's talk about how the hot springs beneath Winterfell are heated by the fires of the world, just like Dragonstone, which is of course correct. Winterfell and Dragonstone, both geothermal hotspots. And they discuss the fact that the small folk around Winterfell say that there is a sleeping dragon beneath the castle, and that's why the springs are hot. Then there's this bit about Jace's visit, and apparently there's a rumor that his dragon Vermax found a warm, cozy nook down in the crypts to lay a clutch of eggs. This is actually possible since it seems that there are entrances to the caverns out in the Wolfswood, the caverns that the crypts are built into. Or it could even be that a dragon's egg was brought by Jacaerys to Cregan to sort of solidify and commit to this pact that they were making. In theory, the dragon's egg would be the egg for the future Targaryen princess that was sent to Winterfell, or perhaps their child. But yeah, it's kind of like a down payment on a future Targaryen. And then, where's the safest place to stash a dragon's egg for many years? Down in the crypts, perhaps. So whether there's an egg down there or not, all this talk about a dragon beneath Winterfell sleeping, or a dragon's egg waiting to hatch beneath Winterfell, well, this probably all refers to Jon Snow, who is of course a hidden Targaryen raised at Winterfell, and who is, again, the fulfillment of the Pact of Ice and Fire. And a lot of people think that while Jon is dead, he will get a chance to finish his recurring crypts dream where he can never finish, he can never walk down to the lowest levels. Well, it's likely that he will finish this dream, and that dream will involve some kind of reveal about his Targaryen nature. Maybe Lyanna will be there. And so when Jon finishes his dream and wakes up and is resurrected, he will then be like a waking dragon, but in a sense, born from the crypts of Winterfell. In complement to this idea is that final Bran chapter of A Clash of Kings, where Bran and company are hiding down in the crypts while Ramsay Bolton is burning and sacking Winterfell. If you remember, Bran warged into summer and saw the castle burning and saw what appeared to be a dragon, a winged serpent whose roar was a river of flame, I believe the words were. And although this is very likely to be colorful writing and not an actual dragon hatching out of the first keep, I believe the point of the colorful writing is to continue to imply that Jon is a dragon who will hatch from Winterfell. And when you get into the specific language of that chapter, it seems to imply that Bran will help him be reborn, which kind of makes sense. Even though we think Melisandre will resurrect Jon, certainly would make sense if Bran was involved also. For now, the point is simply that George has created this parallel between Jace and Sarah Snow and the Pact of Ice and Fire, and Rhaegar and Lyanna, and Jon, who is the fulfillment of that pact. And then he's augmented all of that with all of this stuff about, Vermax's dragon's eggs or a sleeping dragon being beneath Winterfell, but that sleeping dragon is really Jon. Needless to say, all of this crouching direwolf, hidden dragon stuff, to reuse the joke, is more evidence that Jon is the prince that was promised, because, again, Jon riding a dragon is the whole point of Jon being a Targaryen. And then just to tease the Jon's Dragon Dream video, in case you haven't watched that, I do think there is a dragon's egg from Vermax's visit down in the crypts, and I think that dragon's egg is what is sending Jon his recurring crypts dream that he can never finish. So when he does finish it, I believe that it will be revealed to be a dragon dream, and he'll see some sort of a dragon down there in the lowest level of the crypts, and this will be very like when Dany dreamt of Drogon before Drogon hatched, which seems like Drogon is sending Dany the dragon dream from inside his egg. So there may be a similar thing with Jon going on at Winterfell, and the dream would be coming from the egg that came with the Pact of Ice and Fire that Jon fulfills. It's a pretty cool theory, and there's even a parallel to another Targaryen who hides his identity under the name Jon, and that would be Jon the Fiddler. He also has a dragon dream that seems to be coming from a dragon's egg, so check out Dreams Come From Dragons and Jon's Dragon Dream. Both of those videos will tell you more about all of that. All right, Jon the Thief. This will be the Jon and Ygritte section, and Ygritte is in fact another major way that Jon is spelled out as Azor Ahai Reborn. We already talked about Jon's Azor Ahai dream, where he slays Ygritte with his red sword, which is a reenactment of the slaying of Nissa Nissa, but it goes much further than that. For example, when Jon finds Ygritte dying after the Battle of Castle Black, he sees that an arrow of a fellow watchman has pierced her in the middle of the chest, mimicking Azor Ahai stabbing Nissa Nissa through the heart with his red sword. Ygritte, as a wildling redhead, is said to be kissed by fire, and of course that's very true of Nissa Nissa. Best of all, there's some absolutely beautiful astronomical myth that George has created for Jon and Ygritte, which further depicts them in the role of Azor and Nissa. So Jon is remembering a conversation that he had with Ygritte where they're discussing the different names the wildlings and Westerosi give the same constellations. Jon mentions that the Red Wanderer, meaning the planet Mars, is said by the Septons of the faith to be sacred to the smith, while the wildlings call Mars the thief and say that the best time for a wildling man to steal a woman is when the thief is in the moon maid, which we can assume to be a constellation, probably Virgo, who is the celestial virgin, moon maid, celestial virgin. So this is an allusion to a celestial alignment, obviously, where Mars is in front of this moon maid constellation. And Ygritte mentions that just such an alignment was in place the night that Jon stole her. So what does this all mean? Well, the red comet, like the planets, is a wandering star, because both comets and planets do not move in unison with the other stars of the sky. Mars, the Red Wanderer, is sacred to the smith, but Azor Ahai is prophesied to return when the Red Wanderer Comet Edition appears in the sky, and he was a smith too, having used the signature Damascus steel heat, hammer, and fold technique to forge Lightbringer. Oh yes, until the sword was done. And when Ygritte accuses Jon of stealing her the night that the thief, the Red Wanderer, was in the Moon Maid, she's calling him a thief and thus analogizing him to the Red Comet. Azor Ahai put his red blade into his Moon Maiden, which killed her and cracked the moon, and Jon, on that fateful night, was supposed to execute Ygritte, but of course did not. And in fact, when you return to that scene, you'll see that Martin is using the Red Wanderer imagery by having Jon and his Watchmen brothers look up at Ygritte's campfire in the pass and describe it as a red star, and naming it as the destination of their climb. So when Jon climbs up to the red star and puts his sword to Ygritte's throat, it's almost like he's mimicking the Azor Ahai legend while standing on top of the red comet. Jon steals his moon maid from the sky, and of course Azor Ahai stole the moon from the sky, in the sense that he broke it. I think this is also a great parallel to Jon's flaming sword dream, where he and Ygritte again reenacted Azor Ahai and Nissa Nissa, again hundreds of feet up into the air, this time on top of the icy wall instead of the icy frost fangs. Frost fangs. That's kind of a good name for an icy comet, which is kind of like a serpent or a dragon. And the wall itself is compared to a serpent, a sword, and an ice dragon. The wall is also described as being alive with light, like the sword Dawn. And check out the stream Symbolism of the Ice Dragon if you want a lot more of that. And if somebody wants to draw Jon Snow riding the comet like Shia Lud. That would be cool. Alright, it's the aforementioned grand finale time, Sword of the Morning, Jon. Here we go. Alright, so I've said a few times now, all throughout this video, that Dawn and the Last Hero's Dragonsteel and Azor Ahai's Lightbringer are probably all the same sword, or perhaps related swords, like multiple versions of the same type of sword. If something like that is true, it's very exciting because Dawn is still around to be used. And wouldn't you know it, George has engineered a developing plotline with this Darkstar guy who sure sounds envious of his more glorified relative Arthur Dayne, whom he thinks was only great because he possessed Dawn, and who, as I laid out in the video, is heavily foreshadowed to steal Dawn from Starfall and enter Fagon's Kingsguard as a kind of cheap knockoff version of Arthur Dayne. Since Fagon is fake Rhaegar's son, it's kind of fits, doesn't it? In other words, the sword Dawn may be right in the line of fire, if you will, when Daenerys comes to King's Landing and inevitably fights with Fagon. Check out the Darkstar Will Steal Dawn videos if you want the full story, but the point is, the entire Darkstar plotline seems like it is introduced as a way to get Dawn out into the field, presumably so someone can use it, and that someone would be Jon. So first, let's talk about why it is we can be confident that Dawn is this ancient relic. It is the Last Hero's Dragonsteel and Azor Ahai's Lightbringer. And then I'll show you the specific foreshadowing that Jon will wield Dawn and become a new Sword of the Morning. So first, the name Dawn. What better name for a sword that helped win the war for the Dawn and helped end the long night and return the sun to the sky, which is called Dawn. I know it sounds basic, but it's kind of one of those don't overthink it things. Second, any sword made from a meteorite, such as Dawn is said to have been, could be thought of or described as Dragonsteel, because meteors and comets can be seen as dragons, and often are in A Song of Ice and Fire and the real world, as we all know. And then third, Dawn appears to the Maesters to be in all respects identical to Valyrian steel, except for the color, which is like opaque white glass instead of dark folded steel. Valyrian steel is, of course, forged in Dragonfire, which is why Sam and Jon think that this reference to the last hero's blade of Dragonsteel probably refers to Valyrian steel. However, since Valyria wasn't around at the time of the Long Night, Dawn is a more likely candidate to have been this sword than the oldest Valyrian sword, which, again, is still hundreds of years away from existing at the time of the Long Night. And then fourth, it's just kind of a match in the sense that we have this story of a Westerosi last hero with this unique magical sword, and then in all of Westeros, we have one unique magical sword which supposedly has been there since the Dawn Age. And that sword is called Dawn, and War for the Dawn, etc., etc. So, Dawn is probably the last hero's Dragonsteel, and it's also probably Lightbringer. The best reason to think that all of these ideas are related is because George has drawn all of their naming and symbolism from the same place, from the planet Venus, which is associated with words and phrases such as Lightbringer, Lightbearer, Dawnbringer, Son of the Morning, which is similar to Sword of the Morning, obviously. So in other words, both Dawn and Lightbringer are named after Venus. And the Night's Watch, which the last hero led in the War for the Dawn, well, they swear oaths which are also derived from Venus, since they promise to be the light that brings the dawn. Venus, the brightest star in the sky by a magnitude of 4, rises just before the sun as the morning star. So it is literally the light that brings or heralds the dawn, and that's why it's called Dawnbringer and Lightbringer. So yeah, it's all in the names, as you can see, and in the Venus connections. I mean, the Night's Watchmen literally say dawn and light brings when they swear their lives to defend the realms of the living in emulation of the last hero and his original watch. Now, of course, the legends of Azor Ahai Reborn and Lightbringer are from halfway across the world. They're from Asshai, which is a very long way from Westeros. But of course, the Danes say that they are not native to Westeros, but that they came here following the track of the falling star from somewhere else. Now, there is good reason to believe that that somewhere else is Asshai and the surrounding lands, and this is Great Empire of the Dawn theory, of course, which we don't really have time to get into. But there is a 5-hour or so Great Empire of the Dawn iceberg stream that you could consult I just put out last week if you Want to get into that? Or check out the produced video called Great Empire of the Dawn, Westeros, which focuses heavily on the Danes and Hightowers. But the point is, yes, there is a plausible reason to believe that the Danes come from a more advanced ancient Dawn Age civilization of Dragon Lords, and that is essentially the explanation for why Dawn is similar to Valyrian steel, but different. So different civilization of Dragon Lords, slightly different technique. And this explains why Dawn is an anachronistic sword, why it's too advanced to be made by the first men and yet present in ancient Westeros. So yes, Dawn could have come from the east, been originally associated with those Lightbringer myths, and then come to Westeros and become this sword of dragon steel in the hands of the last hero. It could all be the same sword. So this last hero carrying Dawn and winning the war for the Dawn, well, he must have been the first Sword of the Morning, or perhaps the title Sword of the Morning was created in memory of him, or her. We don't know. Of course, that title, Sword of the Morning, is only bestowed on knights of House Dane who are deemed worthy of carrying Dawn. But what I want to point out is that if Jon leads the fight against the others with some kind of magic sword, he'll essentially be the new Sword of the Morning in purpose, if not title. Although technically Jon and Dany do have a decent amount of Dane blood through Diana Dane, Egg's mother. Essentially, Egg was half Dane, then married a Blackwood, Blackbeth of Blackwood, and then their kids preserved that admixture down to Rhaegar and Dany because of 2 generations of brother-sister incest. So speaking in terms of very, very oversimplified genetics, Dany and Rhaegar are as much as 1/4 Dane, and Jon would be 1/8 since he's the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. So it could be that this heritage will figure into Jon eventually being named the new Sword of the Morning by the House Dane High Supreme Council or whatever. The Lady of the Lake held forth her hand, clad in shimmering samite, something, Excalibur, bosom of the water, you get the idea. But the thing I want to focus on now is the foreshadowing that Jon should either literally use the White Sword Dawn or simply perform the original function of the Sword of the Morning with a different sword, such as Longclaw. I'll tell you right now though, I do think he's going to wield Dawn. So we're jumping over to a different scene where Jon is about to chop somebody's head off with his Valyrian steel sword. This time we're in the yard of Castle Black, and instead of the lovely Ygritte, we have the ugly-headed Janos Slynt. Jon's words, ugly-headed. And this time Jon carries out the sentence, but right before he does, the pale morning sunlight ran up and down his blade as Jon clasped the hilt of the bastard sword with both hands and raised it high. "If you have any last words, now's the time to speak them," he said, expecting one last curse. The Sword of the Morning, ladies and gentlemen, wielding his shining sword of pale morning sunlight. So you can see how this might be foreshadowing for Jon. At least it would be, if there was another example of, oh, this was just a couple pages earlier. Jon slid the oilcloth down his bastard sword, watching the play of morning light across the ripples, thinking how easily the blade would slide through skin and fat and sinew to part Slynt's ugly head from his body. See, I told you he has an ugly head, and Jon has a sword running with dawnlight. So maybe he'll have a sword running with dawnlight. I don't know, I'm just saying, this could be foreshadowing. Jon even sees a hopeful vision of such a sword hanging in the sky. Ghost was gone when the wildlings led their horses from the cave. Did he understand about Castle Black? Jon took a breath of the crisp morning air and allowed himself to hope. The eastern sky was pink near the horizon and pale gray higher up. The Sword of the Morning still hung in the south, the bright white star in its hilt blazing like a diamond in the dawn. So after Jon's ghost is gone, meaning after he's dead and resurrected, he will find hope in Lightbringer, the bright white star blazing in the dawn sky like a comet, or like the morning star, shining in the last hours of the darkness before the dawn. This Westerosi Sword of the Morning constellation is almost certainly Orion. It's pretty much gotta be. Orion is the mighty star warrior who appears in the southern sky, and who does have a star sword hanging from his belt, which is in fact made up of an asterism, and an asterism is a name for a small cluster of stars, which is not quite a constellation. It's like a baby constellation. So yeah, Orion's star sword that hangs here from his belt, and you can see it. This is an asterism called Venus's Mirror. So Orion has a Venus-associated star sword. A Lightbringer, in other words. This is what Jon is seeing and taking hope in. And again, I will say that this is a poetic and beautiful way to foreshadow Jon's role as a future Sword of the Morning. At least in function, and perhaps in title. And lest I neglect the most simple and obvious thing, the fact that the white star in the hilt of the Sword of the Morning constellation blazes here is probably a clue that dawn can catch on fire. And then just a little extra tidbit here to make this potentially even cooler. If I'm right that Dark Star is going to steal dawn, essentially in order to bring it out into battle, get killed, and cough it up to somebody more worthy, then it could work out that Dany will come to possess it and be the one to give it to Jon. And if that happens, it would be a very cool echo of Nissa Nissa giving Lightbringer to Azor Ahai. Although again, there won't need to be any murder going on because Jon will be a fire white, yada, yada, yada. He'll be able to light it himself, so. And if you want the deep dive, by the way, on why Jon won't stab Dany for any reason, then check out Azor Ahai, the bad guy. Dawn was, of course, present at Jon's birth at the Tower of Joy, and in fact may even be the bleeding star, quote-unquote, that Jon was born under, speaking in terms of the prophecy. Arthur Dayne no doubt bloodied Dawn in the fight in front of the Tower of Joy. So yeah, there would have been a bleeding star, a bloody meteor sword, right there at Jon's birth. This seems like something Martin or any good writer might think to do, to place the various elements of a character's final destiny there at the scene of their birth. And indeed, it's not just dawn. George has also placed the blue eyes of death up in the sky, which of course are the eyes of the others. I believe that Jon will become a new Sword of the Morning, like Arthur Dayne, and carry the sword Dawn against the others, just as the last hero carried that same damn sword against the others as his blade of dragonsteel some 8 or 10,000 years ago, or whatever it was. And so, in conclusion, Jon and Daenerys are the princes that were promised, and theirs is the Song of Ice and Fire. This fits with the general explanation George has given for the title, Ice and Fire, where he said that the fire refers to Dany and her dragons out in the east, and the ice refers to the things going on up north at the Wall. Jon Snow is right at the center of all the things going on up north at the Wall, involved with the others and the Starks and the Night's Watch and all that. So yeah, Jon and Dany working together to save the world, that would be the Song of Ice and Fire. You always gotta watch out for that discordant note in the melody though, because Euron Crow's Eye is just fairly dripping with Sauron vibes. I mean, look at that sigil. Sauron, of course, was the servant of Melkor, also known as Morgoth, who essentially introduced evil into Eru Ilúvatar's creation with his discordant note. Because, of course, in Tolkien's universe, as readers of the Silmarillion will know, the creation is accomplished through song. So the original sin was a musical one. And all of that is to say, watch out for my Azor Ahai Euron video coming out sometime in the near future. Thanks for watching, everyone. Make sure you're subscribed, and please show this video to a friend if they're struggling with the mystery of who's Azor Ahai. Oh, it's Jon, it's Dany. You're wrong. Help them see the light, folks. Help them see. And of course, I really do appreciate your comments and shares and all that kind of good stuff. I love my job. I love doing this. I love entertaining you guys. So thanks a lot for making this all possible, and I'll see you next time.